There's also a mistake that is made oftentimes in mistaking what are differences in perceptions for a conflict over values. So you have a lot of well-meaning people from the United States and elsewhere going into other countries to teach them about democracy. As if people don't want to be free of atrocities or to be free of human rights violations, as if people have no interest in participating politically in their own societies. The problem is not that there are an absence of Democrats across divided societies. There are lots and lots of very courageous, active Democrats in almost all the nations of Africa. The problem is this larger issue of the definition of the political community. And unless that gets sorted out, you're not going to be able to make much progress. And so, in short, in summary, the conventional wisdom fails to comprehend that the essential task of peace and democracy building in divided societies is building a recognition of the commonalities and interdependence of the population. Now, what I suggested to the World Bank was that, in my view, there were 4 imperatives that had to be successfully addressed if peace was to be made sustainable anywhere in the world. This applies as much to Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan as it does to other African states, or in Asia for that matter, anywhere in the world. The first is you've got to try to transform the conflict paradigm or mentality which sees the world as a zero-sum game in which one person's success or survival can only come at the expense of the other guy. Unless people come to understand that it is in their enlightened self-interest to collaborate even with their competitors, you cannot make peace sustainable. And so you've got to transform that zero-sum paradigm into one in which people begin to search for win-win solutions rather than operating in the zero-sum world. Secondly, one has got to restore the trust and the relationships among key leaders that have been fractured by their conflict. And by leaders here, I don't just mean political leaders. I mean military leaders. I mean civil society leaders from the churches, from women's groups, from academia, and so on. So that people can have confidence that when they make agreements, those agreements will be adhered to. And thirdly, you've got to build a new consensus on the rules of the game. How's power going to be organized? How should it be shared? Who should be at the table when decisions are made? And finally, it's important to strengthen the communications and negotiation skills of key leaders so that they have greater ability to put themselves in the shoes of the other guy and then fashion solutions that will satisfy the interests of all. So those were the 4 objectives that I laid out for the World Bank. And what I specifically argued was that the missing link, the reason we were not finding peace to be very sustainable through conventional means, was the absence of collaborative capacity among leaders. That was the missing link. And that meant if we were going to build that capacity, first of all, defining capacity differently. Whenever you read newspapers or you read the literature and the stuff, people are always talking about technical capacity, managerial capacity, for example, or accounting capacity, what have you. But you've got to include in the notion of capacity building, collaborative capacity building. Secondly, diplomats can't do this work. One of the things I discovered is that none of my colleagues at the State Department were trained in conflict transformation or peace building, believe it or not. Trainers who are trained in organizational development, in transforming political cultures, in creating a sense of team in a fragmented organization. Those are the people that have the skills that need to be brought to the table, and if you're serious about conflict transformation. Now, diplomats have a key role. Only diplomats have knowledge of the country and of the region. Only diplomats have the gravitas to get the key players into a process where trainers can work with them. So in a way, what is really required is a new synergy between trainers and diplomats to move these transformative processes forward. And so what I specifically proposed, well, let me just say one last thing. I want to jump down to the last point for a moment, redefining the role of the international community. The international community historically, and boy, you saw this in spades in Iraq, went in there in a very prescriptive way. Here's what you guys have got to do in order to sort yourselves out and get new structures in place. In our approach to peace building, it is totally non-prescriptive. It is not for us to shape the substance of what our participants in the training programs do. We're facilitators. We're there to provide the space, a safe space. We're there to provide certain skills. But ultimately, it is when we turn to substance, it is the participants that control the agenda, deciding what subjects they want to pursue, what issues they want to tackle. And so the international community becomes less of a prescriptive force and now much more of a facilitative force. And so what we proposed is that we undertake an experiment in Burundi. Excuse me, my voice is. In which what I proposed to the World Bank was that we identify maybe 100 leaders drawn from all social sectors, political, military, civil society, half Tutsi, half Hutu. We spent several months, and the bank decided to sign off on this experiment. And a colleague of mine and I went out to Burundi and spent 3 months just talking to every institutional leader we could find, from the political parties, the government, the rebel organizations, the churches, women's organizations, media, etc. And we got a buy-in from everyone. People thought this was pretty good. They wanted an opportunity, even though they didn't trust each other, they wanted the opportunity to strengthen their own individual leadership skills so they would be in a position to begin to work more effectively with one another in moving post-conflict reconstruction forward. So we got the buy-in, and then we asked these guys if they would give us a list of names, confidentially. If they were organizing the first workshop of 35 people, who would they invite? And we gave them the criterion. We only wanted people who were so influential that they could help shape the future of their country, for better or for worse. We didn't just want the moderates. We wanted the hardliners, the extremists. And I'll never forget, there were particularly two people that started, and so we ended up with, let me just say, we ended up with about 340 names. But we could see which names kept popping up on these different lists. And that became our guide. So we were not selecting people. The Burundians were selecting those that needed to be in the process. And there were these two Tutsi military figures who had terrible reputations for being hardline, for being extremist. One was supposed to have been involved in the assassination of the first democratically elected Hutu president. And all my diplomatic colleagues told me, Howard, you shouldn't invite these guys into the process because they're just going to disrupt it, going to undermine everything you want. But when I saw both Hutu and Tutsi telling me that these guys could undermine the future, we decided we had no choice. We had to invite them. And it was the best decision we ever made because they were so transformed by the process. One of these guys ended up becoming the principal champion of Army integration and reform, and is now served with credibility and with great competency under both Hutu and Tutsi presidents. It was a stunning thing to watch. He would say to people afterwards, that in light of his experience, he can't believe how he looked at the world earlier. Because what was driving his extremism was fear. Tutsi and Hutu had moved into their ghettos. There was no exchange. They had demonized one another. They had stereotyped one another. And when we could break through all of that, then the world was a different place for him and for the others as well. The way we structured our program was to, first of all, conceive of it as a long-term proposition, not just a one-off workshop. Too much work is done in Africa and elsewhere. People go into a workshop, people love the workshop, and they go home. But what happens, of course, is that even when they are transformed by the experience, as they really are in our case, they go back into their own communities where all the traditional pressures impinge to revert to old fears and suspicions and stereotypes. And so you've got to keep bringing people back every 2 or 3 months to deepen their own relationships and to strengthen their skills. And the way we structured our program was to begin in every instance with a 6-day retreat. And then to follow it up every couple of months with 2 or 3 days shorter experiences. And we discovered that in the first basic 6-day retreat, where the training methodology was totally new for these folks, we did not lecture at them. Almost everything was done with the use of simulations and interactive exercises in which people were placed into hypothetical settings where they had to confront the same kinds of tensions and dilemmas they would face in the real world. But because they were hypothetical and not real world, when they sat back to examine their behavior, what had worked, what had not worked, they were much more objective, less defensive.